It's just before dawn on August 1st, 1664. The air along the Rába River in western Hungary is heavy, thick with summer heat and the kind of wet, clinging humidity that follows weeks of rain. The river itself is running high. Weeks of storms have pushed it above its banks in places, and the current is faster than usual, cutting through the reeds and mud along the southern shore. The sky is just beginning to lighten in the east, that thin grey line that precedes actual sunrise. And in that half-darkness, if you were standing on the north bank of the river, near the Cistercian monastery of Saint Gotthard, you would see something that would stop your breath. Across the water, on the southern bank, and spread out across the flat Hungarian plain behind it, is an army. Not a raiding party, not an advance guard, an army. Campfires by the tens of thousands, stretching back into the darkness so far that the light blurs into a single orange glow on the horizon. The sound carries across the water, the low, constant murmur of men, animals, equipment, the creak of wagon wheels, the distant thud of horses. The Ottoman Empire has arrived on the Rába, and it has brought everything it has. On the north bank, the situation looks very different. Roughly 24,500 soldiers are deployed across the defensive line, with 24 cannons to support them. They are Germans, Frenchmen, Austrians, Czechs, Croatians, Hungarians, a coalition assembled through years of desperate diplomatic effort, commanded by men who don't entirely trust each other, and who, at this precise moment, in the pre-dawn grey, are not yet sure what they are looking at across the river. Some of their cavalry have ridden out just this morning to find fodder, because the supply wagons haven't kept up. Their powder and food stores are not what they should be. Vienna is roughly 200 kilometres to the northwest. Graz, the capital of Styria, is even closer. What is crossing this river, or preparing to cross it, is the full field army of the Ottoman Empire, under its Grand Vizier, Kopruluzade Fazıl Ahmed Pasha. The numbers historians cite range widely, but the Ottoman force in the theatre numbered somewhere between 80,000 and 120,000 men. They have hundreds of cannons. They have janissaries, the disciplined professional infantry that had been the cutting edge of Ottoman military power for 2 centuries. They have Sipahi cavalry, Tatar raiders, irregular infantry, siege engineers, and pontoon bridges. And they have been moving toward this river with a clear strategic objective: cross the Rába, clear the road, and march on Vienna. This is the moment that the entire summer campaign has been building toward. The fortress of Nowe Zamki had already fallen the year before, a shock that reverberated through every court in Europe. The road through Hungary had been getting shorter. Now the Ottomans stand on the last significant river barrier before the Austrian heartland, and on the north bank, a smaller, hungry, politically divided Allied army is the only thing standing in their way. By the end of this single day, the course of that campaign, and arguably the trajectory of Ottoman power in Central Europe, will have changed. Not because of a siege, not because of a miracle, not because of weather or disease or bad luck on the march, but because of one tactical decision made at exactly the right moment by a commander who had spent years waiting for precisely this opportunity. On this morning, the Ottoman Empire came closer to cracking open the road to Vienna than it had in a generation. By nightfall, that advance would be broken, and the battle that did it, fought in the mud of a flooding river, in a burning village, by soldiers who didn't share a language, would force both empires to stop, reassess, and ultimately reshape the balance of power in southeastern Europe for the next century. To understand why August 1st, 1664 matters, you have to go back further. Not centuries, just a few decades. And then a few critical years that set everything in motion. Hungary in the mid-17th century was not a single country in any meaningful sense. It was a wound that had never closed. The disaster at the Battle of Mohács in 1526, when the Ottoman army under Suleiman the Magnificent destroyed the Hungarian kingdom in a single afternoon, had split the region into three unequal pieces that had never been put back together. The northern and western strip remained under Habsburg control and was called Royal Hungary. The broad central plain, including the old capital of Buda, was administered as part of the Ottoman Empire, and the eastern principality of Transylvania existed in a strange middle state. Nominally independent, paying tribute to Constantinople, a buffer zone between two empires that had been grinding against each other for over a century. By the 1650s, that grinding had settled into something like a stalemate. Neither empire was in a position to fundamentally change the situation. The Habsburgs were exhausted by the 30 Years' War, which had ended in 1648 but left the Holy Roman Empire deeply fragmented and financially depleted. The Ottomans had their own internal struggles, a period of instability and weak Grand Viziers through the 1640s and 1650s that had sapped the empire's capacity for decisive action. For about 50 years, the frontier between the two powers had barely moved. There were raids, border skirmishes, diplomatic tensions, but no major war. A cold peace, uncomfortable and unresolved, but stable enough to endure. That stability ended because of a chain of events that began not on the Habsburg-Ottoman frontier, but far to the northeast, in Poland. In 1657, the Prince of Transylvania, Georgi Rákóczi II, invaded Poland. This was not a small decision, and it was not his to make alone. Transylvania's status as an Ottoman vassal meant that any military adventure of this scale required the approval of Constantinople. Rákóczi didn't ask. He launched his campaign anyway, got badly beaten by the Poles and their Swedish and Tatar allies, and retreated with a destroyed army. The Ottomans, furious at the unauthorized use of a client state's resources, moved to punish him. They replaced him, and when Habsburg Austria made gestures of support to his successor, János Kemény, who fled to Vienna seeking help, the Ottomans interpreted that as interference in their sphere. The cold peace had a crack in it now. Into this crack stepped the Köprülü family, specifically Fazıl Ahmed Pasha, who became Grand Vizier in 1661 after inheriting the position from his father, Köprülü Mehmed. His father had already done the hard work of restoring Ottoman administrative and military capacity after the chaotic middle years of the century. Fazıl Ahmed was 25 when he took the position. He was educated, had served as a provincial governor, was known for reducing corruption and taxation in the areas he administered. But in war, by all accounts, he was ruthless and methodical. He arrived in office with his father's reformed army, a rebuilt treasury, and an agenda. The agenda was expansion. Meanwhile, on the Habsburg side, Emperor Leopold I was not, by nature or inclination, a wartime leader. He was a meticulous administrator, a deeply devout Catholic, a man whose political imagination was consumed almost entirely by two things: the threat of Louis XIV's France and the question of the Spanish succession. The last Spanish Habsburg, Carlos II, was sickly and childless, and Leopold, himself a Habsburg, was already calculating his position in the inevitable contest over who would inherit Spain's empire. The Ottomans, to Leopold, were a serious problem, but France was an existential one. This matters enormously for what happens after Saint Gotthard, so keep it in mind. When it became clear that Fazl Ahmed intended to move against Habsburg Hungary in force, Leopold did something politically remarkable. He called the Imperial Diet in January 1663 and asked for help, including from Protestant princes, which was deeply uncomfortable for a Catholic emperor conducting an active counter-reformation. Protestant Brandenburg and Saxony agreed to send contingents. More extraordinarily, Louis XIV of France, technically Austria's chief rival in Europe, agreed to send 6,000 troops under Count Jean de Coligny-Saligny as part of the League of the Rhine. France and Austria were enemies, but the Ottoman threat was visible enough that Louis saw advantage in demonstrating French military capability on a prestigious European stage. None of this assembly happened quickly. Armies in the 17th century didn't materialize on schedule. The Imperial Diet agreed in January 1663 to raise 21,000 men. That army barely existed on paper at the time of the vote. It would take most of 1663 and the first half of 1664 to assemble something real. And while Europe was assembling, the Ottomans were moving. In the summer of 1663, Fazl Ahmed led an army of over 100,000 men into Habsburg Hungary. In September of that year, they besieged the fortress of Erzsébet, known to the Ottomans as Újvár, to the Germans as Neuhäusel, and today as Nové Zámky in southern Slovakia. This fortress had repelled Ottoman attacks 6 times before. It had a reputation as nearly impregnable. Fazl Ahmed's army took it in 38 days of sustained bombardment and assault. It became the center of a new Ottoman province. The shock in Vienna was real. After Nové Zámky, Ottoman and Tatar forces raided deep into Moravia, reaching the town of Olomouc. 40,000 captives were taken. Towns were burned. This was not raiding in the old sense. This was the beginning of what looked, to everyone watching, like systematic absorption. The Ottomans weren't probing the frontier anymore. They were pushing through it. The man tasked with stopping this was Raimondo Montecuccoli. Italian-born, a career soldier since the age of 16, who had fought through the entirety of the 30 Years' War, Montecuccoli commanded the Habsburg forces in Hungary with an approach that drove his allies to despair. His strategy was, in essence, patience. Do not engage the Ottoman field army unless the conditions are favorable. Retreat to defensible ground. Force the enemy to come to you on terms you choose. Wait. This drove the Croatian ban Nikola Zrinski nearly to madness. Zrinski was the opposite of Montecuccoli in almost every way. Aggressive, politically passionate, willing to risk everything on an offensive stroke. He had been running cross-border raids into Ottoman territory from his stronghold at Novi Zrin since 1661, trying to provoke a war he believed Austria needed to fight. When the Ottoman army moved against his fortress in the summer of 1664, Montecuccoli refused to commit his army to a relief effort. He was outnumbered and the conditions weren't right. Novi Zrin fell on June 30th, 1664. Zrinski, who had built that fortress with his own resources and watched it go without Habsburg support, never forgave Montecuccoli. He would be dead by November of that same year, a hunting accident, though some suspected otherwise, and the rage he felt would survive him, passed on to his brother and the other Hungarian and Croatian nobles who would spend the next several years looking for a way out of their relationship with Vienna. But that's the aftermath. In July of 1664, the immediate situation was this. Novi Zrin was gone, the southern flank was open, and the Ottoman main army, its elite formations intact, its logistics running, its Grand Vizier confident, pivoted north toward the Rába River and the road beyond it to Vienna. Montecuccoli's waiting game had run out of time. Now he had to fight. The Rába River runs roughly east-west through western Hungary before curving north toward the Danube. In the summer of 1664, it was running high. Weeks of heavy rain had saturated the surrounding lowlands, turning the banks into soft, boggy ground that would slow any formation trying to cross in force. The river itself wasn't enormously wide. It could be bridged with pontoon equipment, which the Ottomans certainly had. But the current was fast enough that an unsupported infantry crossing by boat or ford would be dangerous, especially under fire. The specific location where everything came together was a stretch of the river near the Cistercian monastery of Saint Gotthard, and more precisely, near the small village of Nagyfalu, today the Austrian village of Mogersdorf, right on the modern Austrian-Hungarian border. The monastery sat on the north bank, giving the Christian defenders a recognizable landmark and a solid stone structure that could anchor the defensive line. To the south, the land on the Ottoman side was relatively flat and open, good ground for massing troops, moving artillery, and organizing a crossing operation. To the north, behind the defensive line, the terrain was more varied. Patches of forest, rising ground, the kind of landscape that would funnel attackers and give defenders natural cover. The forested area north of the riverbank would become the critical tactical feature of the battle. When the Ottomans established their bridgehead and pushed troops across, those troops would use the forest to reorganize and consolidate before pushing further inland. That forest concealed them from the Grand Vizier watching from the south bank, which meant he couldn't accurately assess the situation on the far side. And it gave the crossed Ottoman troops cover, but it also confined them, and it meant that when they broke, they had to get back through the same narrow corridor to reach the river. About a week before the battle, the Ottoman army arrived at Kermend, a crossing point further east along the Rába. The Hungarian garrison at Kermend held. They couldn't stop the whole Ottoman army forever, but they denied the Ottomans a clean crossing there, which forced the Ottoman command to shift its attention westward, toward the ford and bridge point near Saint Gotthard. Montecuccoli, getting word of the Ottoman approach, moved his cavalry there first by forced march. His infantry followed, arriving on July 28th, 4 days before the battle. It was a close thing. Any later, and the Ottomans would have established a bridgehead before the defenders were in position. The army Montecuccoli deployed along that north bank was a genuine coalition in almost every sense of the word. The Habsburg contingent itself consisted of roughly 5,000 infantry, organized into 10 battalions, and about 5,900 cavalry in 27 squadrons, supported by 10 guns. The Holy Roman Empire's separate contingent added 6,200 infantry in 6 battalions, 1,200 cavalry in 9 squadrons, and 14 more guns. The League of the Rhine forces, representing the German princes under French political leadership, contributed a further 600 infantry and 300 cavalry. The French corps under Coligny brought 3,500 infantry in 4 battalions and 1,750 cavalry in 10 squadrons. And rounding out the force were approximately 2,000 Croat cavalry and smaller numbers of Hungarian foot soldiers and a Piedmontese regiment. In total, something around 24,500 men with 24 cannons stood between the Ottoman army and the road to Vienna. The weapons these men carried reflected where European warfare was in the mid-17th century. A transitional moment, still working out the details of the military revolution that had been reshaping armies since the early 1600s. The infantry were equipped with a mix of muskets and pikes. The pike, a long spear carried by infantry to protect musketeers from cavalry, was still present in significant numbers, though its proportion was declining as firearms became more reliable and tactically dominant. The muskets in use were matchlock and flintlock types, capable of firing a heavy lead ball with considerable stopping power at ranges up to about 50 meters of useful accuracy, though they were slow to reload and became unreliable in wet conditions. The cavalry included both heavy cuirassiers, armoured horsemen equipped with pistols and sabres, and lighter mounted troops for reconnaissance and pursuit. The French contingent was, by most accounts, among the better drilled infantry in the coalition. French military practice in this period had moved further toward organised volley fire, coordinated volleys from infantry lines delivered in sequence designed to maintain a continuous wall of fire against an advancing enemy. This would matter enormously when the battle began. The logistical situation, however, was not good. Montecuccoli's army had moved fast to beat the Ottomans to the river, and the supply wagons had not kept pace. On the morning of the battle itself, cavalry units had to ride out from camp to find fodder for the horses because the army's feed supplies were exhausted. The gunpowder and food stores were described by contemporary sources as inadequate for a sustained engagement. This was an army that could fight today. Whether it could fight tomorrow was a different question. Across the river, the picture looked very different. The Ottoman army had been campaigning since the spring, had captured Novi Zrin after a month-long siege, and had marched north in relatively good order. The logistical problems they encountered on the approach to the Rába, roads turned to mud by the same rains that swelled the river, supply columns struggling to keep pace with the main force, had slowed the advance but not broken it. Now, on the south bank, the Grand Vizier had his army concentrated and his engineers preparing river-crossing equipment. The Ottoman force that would attempt the crossing was led by its elite formations. At the top were the Janissaries, the professional standing infantry of the Ottoman Empire, recruited through the Devshirme system, trained from youth, loyal to the Sultan and the institution itself. They were disciplined, experienced, and by this period well armed with muskets. Behind them were the Sipahis, both the household cavalry of the Sultan and the provincial Sipahis raised from Timariats, cavalry supported by land grants. Then came the larger masses of irregular and auxiliary infantry, azaps used in the vanguard for initial contact, Sekban mercenary infantry with firearms, and the Tatar cavalry from the Crimean Khanate, used for raiding and flank harassment, and notorious for the scale of the destruction they left in their wake. Artillery had been positioned to cover the crossing, a substantial battery on the south bank capable of suppressing the north bank defenders while the engineers and infantry went across. The pontoon engineers had done this before. Bridge laying across rivers was a standard Ottoman operational capability. They had the equipment, they had the experience, and they had a night to work with. In the Allied camp on the north bank, the evening of July 31st was a study in the tensions that had been simmering through the entire campaign. The fundamental problem was authority. Montecuccoli held the title of Imperial Commander-in-Chief, but his actual authority over the coalition was limited. The French corps under Coligny operated independently. Louis XIV had sent his men to fight alongside the Habsburgs, not under them, and Coligny understood his orders that way. The separate German imperial contingent under Leopold Wilhelm of Baden-Baden was similarly not fully subordinate to Montecuccoli's direct command. The Hohenlohe and Waldeck contingents operated with their own chains of authority. This was an army of allies, not a unified force, and in the 17th century, that distinction was not academic. It could cost you a battle. That evening, Hohenlohe and Coligny, whose forces were positioned on the left flank of the Allied line, grew increasingly concerned about what they were seeing across the river. Movement. Equipment being moved toward the water's edge in the darkness. The sounds of bridge construction. They sent messages to Montecuccoli and to Baden-Baden requesting precautionary orders. Move troops forward. Reinforce the riverbank pickets. Go on alert. Both requests were dismissed. The movement, it was assessed, was probably a feint or a probe. Nothing to warrant a general alarm. Baden-Baden, according to sources from the period, went to bed without issuing any defensive orders at all. The Janissaries, who had been moving forward in the darkness since sometime after midnight, reached their forward positions on the south bank well before dawn. Around 3 or 4 in the morning, the first elements began crossing. A small group came over on camels. The Rába was deep enough that the camels could ford it where a man would have to swim. Others rode double behind Sipahi cavalry who knew the water. The crossing of the main force would need the pontoon bridge, but the initial assault element got across in the pre-dawn darkness using whatever was available. They reached the north bank, moved quickly away from the water's edge, and dug in. By the time the sky began to lighten, they had a trench on the north bank and a defensible position around it. The guard force protecting the ford on the Allied side numbered about 200 men, a picket, not a fighting line. When the Janissaries came out of the darkness and the water, the picket didn't stand and fight. It scattered, retreating to the village of Mogersdorf, and the alarm drums began to beat in the Allied camp at approximately 7 in the morning. By then, the bridgehead was established, and the battle for the Rába had already begun. The alarm that went up through the Allied camp just after 7 o'clock in the morning of August 1st, 1664, was not an orderly alert. It was the kind of alarm that spreads through a camp the way fire spreads through dry grass, in every direction at once, driven by whatever is moving fastest. Men came out of their tents and shelters to find cavalry streaming back from the riverbank, shouting in German and Hungarian and Croatian, horses spooked and hard to control, and across the river the unmistakable sound of a major crossing operation well underway. The Ottoman artillery on the south bank opened up, heavy guns firing across the water to suppress the north bank and cover the continuing movement of troops and the completion of the pontoon bridge. The cannon fire echoed off the monastery walls and rolled back over the river like thunder. On the north bank, roughly 1,000 meters back from the water, the Allied camp was in the early stages of controlled chaos. Soldiers were grabbing weapons and forming up, but without a clear picture of what was happening at the riverbank, the response was piecemeal. The Janissary force that had crossed was already digging its trench and preparing to receive the Sipahi cavalry that would come across once the pontoon bridge was in place. The Ottoman engineers on the south bank were working the bridge sections into position under the cover of the artillery. It was methodical, practiced, and fast. The 2 imperial regiments that held the forward position closest to the bridgehead, the Fugger regiment and a Bavarian regiment, were not prepared for what hit them. When the Sipahi cavalry came across the completed bridge and fanned out from the bridgehead, the contact was sudden and violent. The Fugger and Bavarian units held briefly, then broke. It wasn't cowardice in any simple sense. These were professional soldiers, not militiamen, but they were caught in an exposed position, outflanked on their right by cavalry, receiving fire from the Janissary trench, and the psychological pressure of having the ground cut from under them was overwhelming. They ran. And as they ran back toward the main Allied position, they ran through their own supporting units, spreading the panic with them. Field Marshal Spa, who commanded that section of the line, tried physically to stop the retreating soldiers. He failed. The fear of the Ottoman advance, as one contemporary put it, was simply too great. By 7:30, the Ottoman bridgehead was secure. The Janissaries held their trench. The Sipahi cavalry was moving north of the river, pushing toward the village of Mogersdorf. The Ottoman artillery was still firing from the south bank, providing cover. The Allied left flank, the section of the line closest to the crossing, was partially compromised, and two imperial regiments had essentially ceased to function as coherent units. In the Allied command, the picture was deeply confusing. Montecuccoli, at his command position back from the river, was receiving fragmented reports. The left flank was under pressure. The Fugger and Bavarian regiments had broken. The Ottomans were in Mogersdorf village. Exact numbers were impossible to assess. Over on the far left, Hohenlohe and Coligny, who had been the ones urging caution the night before and who had been dismissed, were now receiving the same fragmentary information and sending urgent messages back to Montecuccoli and Baden-Baden. Act now. Attack now. If the Ottomans consolidate their position in Mogersdorf, retaking it becomes enormously harder. The village of Mogersdorf was the key. It sat perhaps 500 meters north of the river, a small cluster of houses and farm buildings, with enough solid stone structures that defending infantry could hold it against a counterattack almost indefinitely. If the Ottomans got their best formations dug in there, particularly the Janissaries, who were experienced at turning buildings into defensive positions, and if they continued to flow reinforcements across the pontoon bridge, the bridgehead would be permanent. The north bank would be lost. And a permanent bridgehead for an army of 80,000 men on the north bank of the Rába meant the road to Vienna was effectively open. By around 9 in the morning, the Ottomans had reached Mogersdorf. The village was quickly occupied. Ottoman cavalry pushed further north of the village, threatening to wrap around the Allied left and cut the line entirely. The Allied pickets and forward units that had been scattered from the riverbank were falling back, some of them in reasonable order, and some of them simply running. The tactical situation for the Allies had gone in the space of 2 hours from defensible to critical. And in the Allied command, the fundamental crisis of the coalition was playing out in real time. Montecuccoli's nominal authority was being tested. The French corps under Coligny and the German imperial contingent under Baden-Baden were both waiting for clear orders. But the structure of the coalition meant that Montecuccoli couldn't simply give orders and expect them to be obeyed in the way a unified army commander could. He had to persuade. He had to convince independent commanders, whose loyalty was ultimately to their own rulers, to subordinate themselves to a coordinated plan at the moment of maximum stress, when every instinct was pushing towards self-preservation and independent action. It is worth pausing here to consider what Montecuccoli was actually reading on that battlefield, because what he did next defined the outcome. What he understood, and what the chaos around him obscured, was that the Ottomans who had crossed the river were in a tactically exposed position. They had taken the village. They had cavalry north of the village. They looked, from the outside, like a force in control of the situation. But they were also reorganizing. The Janissaries and Sipahis who had crossed in the morning's assault had been in action for 2 hours. They had fought their way through the picket line, expanded the bridgehead, taken Mogersdorf, and pushed the Allied forward units back. Now they needed to consolidate, to tighten their perimeter, receive reinforcements across the bridge, and prepare for the Allied counterattack they knew would come. Part of that consolidation meant pulling back from exposed forward positions toward the tree line and the forest north of the village, where they could regroup out of direct artillery range and under cover. The Janissaries in the forward positions had moved into that forest. That was the window. Once they were settled, resupplied and organized, retaking Mogersdorf would cost the Allies far more than attacking now, while the Ottoman forces were in the middle of their own reorganization. Montecuccoli rode to Coligny. The conversation that followed, we don't have a verbatim account, but the outcome is clear, was not a command. It was an argument. Coligny was sceptical of risking his French corps in what looked from his position like a deteriorating situation. The logical move, if you were thinking about preserving your forces, was to pull back, stabilize the line, and wait for the Ottomans to overextend. Montecuccoli's counter was essentially this: there is no stable line to fall back to. If the Ottomans consolidate on the north bank, this army cannot retake it. The time to act is now, while the Ottomans are between positions, reorganizing in the forest, where the Grand Vizier across the river cannot see them clearly or reinforce them effectively. Attack now, in a coordinated strike from multiple directions simultaneously, and the crossed Ottoman force, however elite, is outnumbered on the north bank by the full Allied force it hasn't yet had to face. Wait an hour, and that arithmetic changes. Coligny agreed. Montecuccoli then went to Baden-Baden and made the same argument. Baden-Baden agreed. Orders went out, coordinated, simultaneous. Not a single column attack on Mogersdorf, but a three-pronged approach, designed to hit the Ottoman bridgehead from multiple angles at once, and prevent any one Ottoman formation from repositioning to cover the others. Count Waldeck would take cavalry north of the village, to drive back the Ottoman horse that had pushed past Mogersdorf and was threatening the Allied left. Hohenlohe would take 2 infantry battalions and 4 cavalry squadrons directly at the village. The French infantry would advance in line formation against the main Janissary position, and the Allied artillery, all 24 guns, would concentrate their fire on the south bank to disrupt the flow of reinforcements across the pontoon bridge. By 10 in the morning, the orders were issued. The Allied army, which an hour earlier had been in danger of breaking entirely, began to move. The first element to go in was Waldeck's cavalry, pushing north to deal with the Ottoman horse that had wrapped around the Allied left. This was not a dramatic cavalry charge across open ground. It was a push, squadron by squadron, against Ottoman cavalry that was itself not in a great position. The Ottoman horsemen north of Mogersdorf had ridden hard after the initial breakthrough and were now spread out, without the concentrated weight that cavalry needed to hold ground against a serious counterattack. Waldeck's men drove them back toward the village. Not a rout, but a significant reversal. The threat to the Allied left flank was reduced, and Hohenlohe's infantry could now advance on Mogersdorf without worrying about being hit from behind. Hohenlohe went in around 11 o'clock. 2 battalions of infantry and 4 squadrons of cavalry, moving against a village that Ottoman infantry had had about 2 hours to fortify. This was ugly, close fighting. the kind that street-by-street combat has always been in any era. Mogersdorf was burning. The Janissaries who had barricaded themselves in the stone buildings were firing from windows and doorways, and each house had to be cleared individually. The infantry went building to building, while the cavalry covered the flanks and prevented a breakout. Hohenlohe retook most of the village, but a cluster of buildings held. A small group of Janissaries refused to leave, and they held those last few structures through most of the afternoon. While the fight for Mogersdorf was going on, the French infantry under Coligny were advancing against the main Ottoman concentration, the larger body of Janissaries and Sipahis who had crossed the river and were using the tree line and forest north of the river for cover. This is where the discipline and tactical approach of the French contingent became decisive. The standard Ottoman infantry assault, when fighting European armies, relied on massed advance, shock, and the psychological weight of numbers. The Janissaries were good soldiers, experienced, brave, capable of withstanding considerable punishment. But the tactical doctrine in use was largely one of advancing in mass toward the enemy and closing to close-quarters combat, using firearms primarily in the initial phase before going to edged weapons for the decisive moment. Against poorly organized or badly led European infantry, this was highly effective. It had worked in countless engagements across 2 centuries. What it had not encountered, at least not in this form, was the European linear musket tactic in its mid-17th century incarnation. The French infantry advanced in dressed lines, 3 or 4 ranks deep, and when they came within effective range, they fired by volley. Not every man firing at once, that would have left a dead interval while everyone reloaded, but in sequence, so that one rank was always ready while the others reloaded. Sustained, coordinated volley fire, delivered from a formed line, maintained a continuous output of lead shot that individual massed infantry advancing in column could not effectively suppress or outrun. The Janissaries were good musketmen, but they were in a disadvantaged position, recently crossed, reorganizing in the forest, not in their own preferred attack formation. And they were receiving fire from a disciplined French line that wasn't flinching. The casualties in the forward Ottoman positions mounted fast. Men who had crossed the Rába 2 hours ago and driven a Habsburg regiment off the field now found themselves pinned against a tree line, taking casualties from an enemy they could barely see clearly through the smoke and the dappled forest light. The Ottoman artillery on the south bank was still firing, but the Allied attack had pushed the engaged forces close enough together that accurate artillery support from across the river was becoming dangerous to both sides. The Grand Vizier, watching from the south bank, was facing a problem that compounded with every passing minute. He could see that his forces on the north bank were in a fight. He could not see clearly how that fight was going. The forest concealed the situation from him. The smoke from Mogersdorf's burning buildings drifted across the river, and the reports coming back across the bridge were fragmentary and contradictory. He had 30,000 men on the south bank, essentially untouched, that he could have committed to reinforce the bridgehead. The bridge was there. The crossing was possible. He did not commit them, not yet. He was waiting for clearer information, trying to understand the tactical situation on the far bank before throwing more forces into what might be a manageable local setback, or might be a developing disaster. It was a reasonable instinct for a commander who couldn't see what was happening. And it was the instinct that lost him the battle. By midday, the fight for Mogersdorf was still ongoing in its last few buildings. Waldeck's cavalry had stabilized the Allied left flank, and the French infantry were pressing the main Janissary concentration hard. The Ottoman forward positions were taking serious casualties. And then came the order that broke everything. Fazl Ahmed Pasha, watching from the south bank and trying to make sense of what he was seeing, ordered the Janissaries to pull back from their forward position to a shorter, tighter defensive line closer to the river. It was a textbook defensive consolidation move. Shorten the perimeter, concentrate the defense, present a harder target to the attacking enemy. In theory, on a battlefield where the commander could see the whole picture, it might have worked. It might have given the Janissaries a more defensible position and bought time for reinforcements to cross. What actually happened was something else entirely. The Janissaries in the forward positions received the order and began moving back. The men fighting around them, the Azap infantry, the secondary formations that had crossed after the elite Janissary spearhead, saw the Janissaries moving rearward and drew the obvious conclusion. The elite troops were retreating. If the Janissaries were pulling back, the battle was lost. There was no time to explain the order, no way to communicate that this was a tactical redeployment rather than a flight. The panic that started in the secondary formations hit the Janissaries from behind before they could complete their movement to the new defensive line. And then the Allied attack, which had been pressing hard all morning, came in. The Janissaries, caught between the pressing French infantry in front and the panic spreading behind them, broke. Not slowly, not partially. They broke completely, and what had been a controlled redeployment became a rout in the space of minutes. The Sipahis behind them, who had been holding their position on the flanks of the bridgehead, saw the Janissaries running and broke in turn. The cascading collapse was total. Thousands of men, many of them among the most highly trained in the Ottoman military, ran for the river. The Rába was the problem. It had been the problem all morning for the defenders, and now it became the executioner of the attack. The river was fast and high, as it had been all week. The pontoon bridge was there, but it was narrow, a bridge designed for a measured military crossing, not for 10,000 panicking men trying to escape simultaneously. Men fought each other to reach the bridge. Men jumped into the river and were swept away by the current. The bodies of drowned soldiers began moving downstream with the current, even as the rout was still in progress. Later accounts described men fighting each other in the water, in the desperate mathematics of drowning. Every man trying to grab something solid, and the only solid things being other men. On the south bank, the Grand Vizier watched what was happening. He had 30,000 fresh troops. He could still, theoretically, have sent them across, overwhelmed the Allied force with sheer numbers, and turned the rout back into a battle. He did not. The collapsing formations pouring back across the bridge and into the river made any organized advance across that same river impossible. A fresh formation trying to advance would have been moving directly against the current of its own fleeing comrades. The chaos on and around the bridge made it impassable for any organized troop movement. Köprülü Fazl Ahmed Pasha ordered a general withdrawal. The Allied pursuit was limited. Montekukuli's army had taken somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 casualties during the morning's fighting, a significant percentage of a force that had started the day at 24,500. The men were exhausted. The river was still in flood, meaning that any crossing to pursue the retreating Ottomans was dangerous. And on the south bank, whatever remained of the Ottoman army, the 30,000 fresh troops, the artillery, the Tatar cavalry, the remaining Sipahis, was intact. Going across the Rába after them with a battered force of under 20,000 men was not a tactical option any responsible commander would consider seriously. Darkness came. The battle was over. On the north bank, the Allies held the field. In the burning ruins of Mogersdorf, the last few janissaries in the last few stone buildings finally stopped firing, either killed, captured, or slipping away in the dark. The pontoon bridge that the Ottoman engineers had constructed with such precision in the early morning hours was either destroyed or drifting downstream. The artillery on the south bank had gone quiet. The camp sounds that had filled the night before, the vast, oceanic sound of a massive army at rest, had changed character. Somewhere on the south bank, in a camp that had held the greatest Ottoman field army assembled in a generation, men were counting who had come back and who had not. The morning of August 2nd, 1664, found the banks of the Rába transformed. The north bank near Mogersdorf, which 24 hours earlier had been a Christian defensive position, was now a wreckage of what the previous day had done to it. The village was partially burned. The fighting inside it had been close enough that fire had spread through several buildings, and the stone walls that the janissaries had used as cover stood blackened and broken. The ground between the village and the river was marked with the detritus of the rout. Abandoned weapons, equipment, clothing, the personal effects of soldiers who had thrown away anything heavy in the sprint for the water. Along the riverbank itself, and in the river, were bodies. The Rába was carrying some of them downstream, the current doing what rivers do with what gets put into them. Others lay on the bank, where the panic had finally caught up with the men running for the water. The casualty counts from Saint Gotthard have always been approximate, because counting the dead of a 17th century battle involved guesswork, motivated reporting, and the simple reality that some of the dead were in a river and weren't going to be counted at all. The Ottoman losses were heavy and concentrated in precisely the worst place, their elite formations. Different contemporary sources give numbers ranging from 7,000 to 22,000 Ottoman dead. The most careful recent estimates tend toward the lower end of that range for the killed in action count, with the understanding that the drowned soldiers represented a significant and essentially uncountable addition. What is clear from all accounts is that the casualties fell overwhelmingly on the janissaries and sipahis, the professional fighting corps of the Ottoman army, rather than on the irregulars, the Tatars, or the auxiliary formations who had largely not crossed the river. This asymmetry mattered enormously, and Fazl Ahmed understood it. The Grand Vizier returned from Saint Gotthard not merely defeated, but fundamentally diminished. The army he led away from the Rába was substantially less capable than the one he had brought to it. Not because of its numbers, the bulk of the force was still intact, but because its cutting edge was gone. The formations he had left were Azaps, Tatars, irregulars, secondary cavalry. The janissaries who had died in the river and in the forest near Mogersdorf were replaceable on paper and in years. They were not replaceable in weeks. On the imperial side, Montecuccoli's losses were estimated at 5,000 to 6,000 men, reducing his effective force to something under 20,000. These losses fell primarily on the German imperial contingent, the units that had been in the front line when the Ottoman crossing went in, rather than on the French brigades, which had come into action in the coordinated counterattack and fought from a more advantageous position. The French corps remained the best organised and most intact formation in the Allied army at the end of the day. Montecuccoli himself was unhurt, and more importantly, the tactical logic he had argued for, wait, force the enemy to the crossing, then attack at the moment of maximum exposure, had been vindicated so completely that his reputation in European military circles went from respected to something approaching legendary. Within months of the battle, he was being called the saviour of Christendom. He would be named Generalissimo of all imperial forces in 1664, and eventually President of the Hofkriegsrat, the Supreme Imperial War Council. The battle had made him. The Habsburg army did not pursue. It could not. The reasons were practical. The river was in flood. The Ottoman army retained a substantial intact force on the south bank, and Montecuccoli's men were exhausted and undersupplied. But the decision not to pursue was also, in retrospect, a preview of what was about to happen at the diplomatic table. The military victory was decisive. The political response to it was not. 9 days after the battle, 9 days, the Peace of Westphal was signed on August 10th, 1664. Europe was stunned. The terms were extraordinary for a treaty signed by the winning side. The Habsburgs recognized Ottoman control of Transylvania and of Erzequivir, the fortress that had fallen in 1663, which had been the proximate cause of the war. Austrian garrisons were to be withdrawn from Transylvania. The Habsburgs agreed to pay the Ottoman Empire an annual sum that was diplomatically described as a gift, a fig leaf over what was functionally a tribute payment. In exchange, the Ottomans agreed to a 20-year truce, to send reciprocal gifts to Vienna, and to allow the construction of a Habsburg fort along the Rába River. On paper, the Ottomans had won. They lost the battle and won the treaty. Leopold's reasoning, as noted earlier, was entirely strategic from the Habsburg perspective and had almost nothing to do with Hungary. France was the real concern. The Spanish succession was coming. The French troops who had just fought alongside the Habsburgs were already socializing with Hungarian and Croatian nobles, and Leopold could see clearly the shape of a French-backed Hungarian independence movement forming on his eastern flank. Better to close out the Ottoman war quickly, on whatever terms were available, than to fight a prolonged eastern campaign while the western front remained open. The liberation of Hungary was a future problem. France was a present one. The Hungarian and Croatian nobility had a different view. For them, Saint Gotthard had been the moment. The battle they had been fighting toward for a generation had finally happened. The Ottomans had been beaten in the open field. The road back, the long, expensive, violent road back to a unified and liberated Hungary, had seemed, for 9 days, like it might finally be opening. And then Vienna closed it again, not with a Turkish sword, but with an Austrian pen. Nicholas Zrinski was dead by November of 1664. He was killed in a boar hunting accident that not everyone believed was an accident. But his brother Petr Zrinski and his brother-in-law Fran Krsto Frankopan were very much alive. And so was the Hungarian Palatine Ferenc Veselényi. These men, and others like them, had watched Montecuccoli decline to relieve Novi Zrin, watched the battle at Saint Gotthard won and then abandoned diplomatically, and now watched the terms of Westphal settle over Hungary like a sentence. They began to meet. They began to plan. First, they sent feelers to France. Louis XIV might support Hungarian independence, might be interested in a client state on Austria's eastern border. Then, in a move of breathtaking desperation, they sent an emissary to Constantinople. The men who had just fought the Ottomans at Saint Gotthard were now quietly exploring whether the Sultan might offer them better terms than their own emperor. The conspiracy was exposed in 1670. Petr Zrinski and Fran Krsto Frankopan were arrested, tried and beheaded at Wiener Neustadt in April 1671. Veselényi had died in 1667 before the conspiracy fully developed. The executions shocked the Croatian and Hungarian nobility, gave Leopold a pretext for years of political repression in the region, and embedded a generation of anti-Habsburg resentment that would continue to surface in various forms through the rest of the century. The Peace of Waszwa had created this. The battle it followed had not. Here is what Saint Gotthard actually changed, stripped of the poetry. First, it proved something that had been unclear for a very long time. The Ottoman field army, even its elite formations, could be beaten by a smaller European force in open battle, if that force was properly coordinated and attacked at the right moment. This sounds almost obvious in retrospect, but it was not obvious in 1664. The psychological weight of Ottoman military success since Mohacs, 138 years of consistent expansion, of fortress after fortress falling, of European armies breaking against Ottoman pressure, had created a kind of institutional despair in Habsburg military thinking. You could slow the Ottomans down, you could hold certain fortresses, you could not meet them in the open and win. Saint Gotthard demonstrated unambiguously that this was wrong. Montecuccoli understood the implications immediately. In his role as president of the Hofkriegsrat after the battle, he pushed through a series of military reforms that directly addressed what Saint Gotthard had shown about the relative strengths and weaknesses of both armies. He introduced a lighter musket, easier to handle and faster to load than the heavy weapons then in use. He reduced the proportion of pikemen in imperial infantry formations and replaced them with musketeers, accelerating the shift from the pike and shot mixed formation toward all firearms infantry. He elevated grenadiers, soldiers who threw explosive projectiles, into a distinct elite infantry category. These reforms were not dramatic in themselves, but they moved the Habsburg army further along the path toward the kind of linear, firepower-dominant infantry force that had proved so effective when the French brigades delivered their volleys against the Janissaries in the forest near Mogersdorf. The army that lifted the Second Ottoman Siege of Vienna in 1683 was built, in part, on the institutional lessons of 1664. The 20-year truce that followed Waszwa gave both empires time they used in very different ways. The Ottomans, with the western frontier stabilized, completed the conquest of Crete from Venice in 1669, after a decades-long struggle, and turned their attention to campaigns in Poland and Ukraine. These were significant military efforts, and they consumed Ottoman resources and attention through the 1670s. When Merzifonlu Kara Mustafa Pasha, Fazıl Ahmed's successor as Grand Vizier, who had inherited the ambitions of the Köprülü dynasty without necessarily inheriting its judgment, marched on Vienna again in 1683, he was committing to a strategic gamble that the events of 1664 should, perhaps, have cautioned against. The 1683 Siege of Vienna is one of history's better-known dramatic reversals. The Ottoman army that invested the city numbered around 140,000 men. The relief force that broke the siege, a coalition of imperial, Polish and other European forces, defeated the besieging army in a single day. The rout at Vienna in September 1683 was, in scale and decisiveness, an amplified version of what had happened at Mogersdorf 19 years earlier, and the Great Turkish War that followed. The sustained campaign of 1683 to 1699 finally drove the Ottoman Empire from most of Hungary, achieving what Montecuccoli had advocated after Saint Gotthard and what Waszwa had delayed by 2 decades. Saint Gotthard did not end Ottoman power in southeastern Europe. It didn't immediately liberate a single Hungarian city or recover a single lost fortress. But it ended something that mattered in a different way. It ended the assumption that the Ottoman field army was qualitatively different from any European force it might face. That the Janissaries and Sipahis represented a category of military capability that European organization and firepower couldn't match. After 1664, that assumption was no longer available. European commanders who studied the battle, and many did because Montecuccoli wrote about it, and the battle was widely documented in military and political circles, understood that disciplined linear infantry with coordinated command could break the best Ottoman formations even at numerical disadvantage. That knowledge accumulated. It shaped how Habsburg planners thought about the 1683 campaign and the campaigns after it, and the long unravelling of Ottoman power in the Danube basin that continued through the 18th century. What Leopold I did with his victory, the decision to trade it for a quick diplomatic settlement, is one of the more debated choices of 17th century European statecraft. Historians who are sympathetic to Leopold's position note that he was not wrong about France. The War of Devolution began in 1667, and the broader conflict with Louis XIV dominated the next several decades of European politics exactly as Leopold had anticipated. Historians who are less sympathetic note that the Vassar Treaty radicalized the Hungarian and Croatian nobility, created the conditions for the magnate conspiracy, and ultimately cost the Habsburgs years of internal instability that complicated their dealings with both France and the Ottomans. The choice that seemed strategically rational in August 1664 produced consequences that were still playing out in 1671 and 1683 and beyond. The Cistercian monastery of Saint Gotthard still stands, though it has been rebuilt and modified many times in the centuries since the battle. The village of Mogersdorf, the Nagyfalu, where the Janissaries barricaded themselves in burning buildings, and where the coordinated Allied attack went in around 11 o'clock in the morning of August 1st, 1664, is a quiet place today. On the hill above it, on a ridge called the Schusselberg, there is a stone cross. It was erected to mark the battlefield. Tourists photograph it. Academics argue about the troop numbers and the casualty estimates and the precise sequence of events on the river that morning. The Rába runs below the hill, smaller now than it was in 1664, the flow regulated by modern water management, the floods that shaped the battle's outcome tamed into predictability. Centuries later, the field at Mogersdorf is quiet farmland. But on that one afternoon in 1664, in a burning village on a swollen river, the mathematics of an empire's expansion ran into something it hadn't fully accounted for. Not the walls of Vienna, not the weather, not a plague, but a coordinated attack at exactly the moment when coordination was hardest and mattered most. The Ottoman advance into Central Europe had crested. It would try again in 1683 and fail again, more completely. But the crest had been reached here, on the Rába, in the mud and smoke of Mogersdorf. And nothing that came after was quite the same.